Hello, seventh graders. We're going to wrap up our final thing of notes today. Make sure you have your assignments turned in by Friday. On Friday, I will post the final assignment from me for your seventh grade year. It needs to be completed instead of by next Friday. The date's going to be a little bit earlier, so watch that because I think Miss Gooder said Tuesday is her cutoff date. Mine's definitely going to be Tuesday or Wednesday next week just so I can get everything graded. So make sure you get that done a little bit earlier than normal. You won't need your book. It's just a document thing. So if you take your book back before then, it's not a big deal. So we left off talking about some of that Reconstruction. There are, let's go back one. There are three sort of main groups that are or names that you'll see sometimes thrown around. So you have freedmen. Those are obviously former slaves looking for equal rights. You have scalawags. Scalawags are white Southerners who swore afterwards that they had opposed the war. So people who are sort of on the northern side living in the south. And then you had people who are called carpetbaggers, who are northerners who then moved south after the war and were not well received in some areas because they were seen as people were coming to change the outlook or layout of the land in a way. But there are people who are being denied rights in the south, that is not necessarily just these former slaves. You have anyone who fought against or was disloyal to the Union in some of these places are being denied rights to vote, not being granted full restoration of rights under the radical Reconstruction government. And in some areas, the other way around. In some areas, these registered to vote former slaves are being physically prevented from voting. They're being physically attacked when they go in to vote. And there's obviously some pretty big problems there, right? The election of 1868 is huge because you can see the red states here. Overwhelming majority of states vote for Ulysses S. Grant, the former war hero, to now be president, right? And part of the reason why he won some of these southern states is not because the South have had a change of heart about him. It's because the South has now hundreds of thousands of African Americans who are registered to vote that could never vote before. And if you're choosing between the guy, who helped fight to free you in a way, maybe not directly, but he fought the war, and after the war they were freed, right? Versus the guy who represents a party who was in control in the South beforehand and wanted to keep slaves, that's a real no-brainer, right? So in some of these states where African Americans were safe enough to go vote, they overwhelmingly voted for Grant. And his presidency is fairly successful. There's going to be some changes that come about that are very good during his time as president. The problem where Grant's concerned is that the people he surrounds himself in his presidential cabinet didn't make the best choices. There's going to be some scandal and sort of things to get out about people he has as advisors. But he himself is never found guilty of committing any crimes as president. But it is worth mentioning that there is some scandal there, right? The 15th Amendment is passed, which guarantees the right to vote to former slaves, male slaves, not women, and expands that voting rights to northern African Americans as well. So people who were not slaves because there wasn't slavery in the North, at that time, they also will now get the right to vote. And in some areas, this is a huge change. I think politically, if you're running for office, you now have to figure out what these new voters want, right? Because you want them to vote for you, you have to be able to promise them things. In some areas, it just leads to increased violence and threats and ways to prevent them from voting, right? So in some areas, it backfires. In some areas, it makes a lot of progress. And you can see some of the progress it makes because in some of these places, we have African-American men who now become members of Congress. The 41st and 42nd Congress has, what's pictured here to be 7, black members of Congress, right? Less than 10 years after the Civil War, after the ending of slavery, there were already black men holding public office. And that's an example of how during radical Reconstruction, when the Republican Party was in charge of Congress, that a lot of good happened. A lot of progress and civil rights happened. And things were changing very rapidly. But a lot of Southern whites did not like this system of government. They're often saying that this government is being forced upon them, saying they're being put in positions where they're not getting their voices heard, where they're sort of being controlled by that, strong Congress, right? The thing is, you have a lot of pushback with that. You have people who sort of feel that, that's a just punishment. You have people that feel like that's overstepping boundaries, and kind of goes back and forth. But by 1870, the former Confederate states have all been readmitted or rejoined the Union. And there was a lot of debate, and we would have discussed this a little bit in class, but there's a lot of debate as to, like, how much of this is free will and how much of it isn't. Because in some of these states, there were federal troops still stationed in the South in the 1860s, 1870s, and it's like, it's government at gunpoint in a lot of ways, right? Understandably so, the argument that they had just fought a rebellion, they probably should, maintain some order there. But at the same time, if the message is, we're all Americans again, we're putting the past behind us, having soldiers stationed there might not be the best way to do it, right? So some Southerners sort of lash out against this treatment. This is where we see what are called like white terrorist groups. So you have the White League or the Ku Klux Klan being formed, and these groups, their goal is to spread terror. Their goal is to scare, these freedmen, these former slaves in the South from voting, to scare them from participating in government. Things that, they should, according to the law, be allowed to do in practice, right? And these groups, the thing about it is they're anonymous. Right? The Ku Klux Klan, they wear these white hoods. You don't know who they are. And if you're living in the South, what do you do to combat that? Because you can't even go to the police, because in some of these areas, your local sheriff could be a member of these groups, right? And it could be anyone, right? It could be your neighbors. And there's that level of sort of fear to that, and that understanding of it could be anyone, right? And they really get sort of a stranglehold in some of these areas. The Klan gets very powerful in some areas in the South, and they begin to undo a lot of the good changes that have been taking place during that time period. And you see the why is that cut off? Weird. You see the sort of return of the Democratic Party in parts of the South. This picture says worse than slavery. You see the White League and the KKK sort of shaking hands here, and you have this general sort of corruption. So some of the government in the South, the Republican government, was starting to get a little bit corrupt, like taking bribes and things, and that sort of led to some fall of power there in 1872. The Confederates are completely pardoned and forgiven for any crimes, and 4 years later, the Democrats begin to start winning elections in the South again, and part of that's because they're oppressing enough black voters that they can't vote Republican anymore. They can't vote for these other parties, and the whites begin to take control again, take control over Reconstruction in the South, and we start to see things regress, go backwards, and really not a great situation. And this is where Reconstruction starts to fall apart, and how you can make the argument by the time it's over that Reconstruction fails, that the United States is not completely restored peacefully, and that the issues that the Civil War was involved in weren't resolved, because you're not going to have the real civil rights movement in the United States until the 1950s and 60s, right? Almost 100 years later, there's still going to be huge issues of racism going on in there, still huge conflicts, right? And the end of it is sort of this election of 1876, where Rutherford B. Hayes is 20 electoral votes shy of being president, and he kind of creates a compromise where, to get the votes he needs to be president, he agrees to give the southern states sort of freedom to go back and run their own show, like saying that we're not going to interfere anymore, we're going to let each state do its own thing. Historians mark this date as the end of Reconstruction, because at this point, when he gives up that ability, when he hands control back over to these southern states, there's not going to be any more positive laws being passed for these former slaves. Black people in the South are going to go back to being oppressed pretty badly. Now, while they can't be legally slaves again, they can find ways to make things very unpleasant for them, right? And we start to see that whole system get much worse, and a lot of the old sort of ways of slavery starts to come back. And so we mark that as the end of Reconstruction. Not good. The New South is very much not a great place. The average income is 40% of that of Northerners. That's for black and white people in the South. So income's not great. The amount of money It's not good. You have former slaves taking servant jobs. It's very difficult for people to feed their families. You have widespread poverty, people living in shacks. It's not a good system, right? With that comes the idea of sharecropping. Sharecropping is where you have tenant farmers. They rent the land that they grow food on. And you could either pay that rent in like a share of the crops you grow or a cut of the money you make from selling those crops. But sharecropping is in a lot of ways financial slavery because you can decide how much you're going to charge them for rent, and you can also rent them tools and seed and things, and you can pretty much ensure that they can't ever leave, that they have to work that land forever, that it's very similar in a lot of ways to slavery. Now, it's not the case for all sharecroppers. There were some that probably had some pretty decent deals, but for the most part, sharecropping experience in the South was pretty bad. It wasn't as bad as slavery, but it was not really truly freedom, right? And that's an example of the failure of Reconstruction, right? That only happened because Reconstruction failed, and these Democrats who regained control in the South had pushed these programs, through. At the same time, even education is not great in this new South, right? Yes, they're reopening schools. During radical Reconstruction, a lot of schools were opened and funded, and part of the Freedmen's Bureau had offered, education for these former slaves. And one of the first things that happens when Reconstruction ends or is declared over, they go and close a lot of these schools. They close them down. Less than 60% of white children in the South attended school, and less than 49% of black children attended school. That's really low education numbers, right? And we've talked many times about how when your education numbers drop, it's bad for your country or your city, right? How it causes all sorts of increases in crime and things. That's going to happen in the South, right? They're not in school. What are they doing? A lot of times they're working, right? Remember, people are living in poverty. You sort of have to have your children bring in some extra money. And the schools that are available are not quality schools. There are some, mainly for white rich people only, that are going to provide, decent education. But for the most part, you've got really low quality schooling. Reconstruction kind of starts to take steps backwards. They institute poll taxes. You have to pay to vote. That's excluding two groups of people, right? Freed slaves and poor white people. They can't go vote. Who stays in power? The rich white people. They create what's called the grandfather clause later on that says any laws pertaining to voting don't apply if you have someone in your family who was able to vote before January 1st, 1867. Time period when only white people could vote. So that grandfather clause might as well just say white people can vote, but if you're black, you have to pay all these taxes and things, right? There's a literacy test. If we're in school, I have an actual copy of the state of Louisiana's literacy test, and it's a really fun activity where I make everybody in the 7th grade take it, and it's to see if you can read. It's a literacy test. It's impossible to pass it because each question can be interpreted however I want. It's like trick questions, basically. They would give those out. You'd be chosen at random, quotes, right, to take these literacy tests. By random, I mean they pick either poor whites or black people they don't want to vote, and they make them take this test, and they can say, you didn't pass, you don't get to vote, because you can't read, you're not literate. It was a way of excluding them from being able to vote. So poll taxes, literacy tests, these go all the way to the Supreme Court. People make court cases saying this is not fair voting. The Supreme Court ruled that it was fair to do that. They ruled it was fair to give a literacy test. It was fair to make them pay money, a poll tax. You can see how Reconstruction has really failed, right? You can't vote. These are things that are purposefully created to exclude black people from voting. It gets worse when they come to segregation, right? This idea of Jim Crow laws come about, laws that are targeting black people specifically. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson, and the Supreme Court has ruled that separate but equal is fair. The Supreme Court says that it is okay, it is legal to have separate facilities for white people and black people as long as they are equal, right? But the equal is not necessarily what you think here, right? These water fountains, the one on the left is the colored water fountain, the one on the right is the whites only water fountain. Under this, the Supreme Court ruled this is equal. They are both providing water to drink. These are not equal quality water fountains, though. right? This is a nice plugged-in, cooled one. This is like runoff tap water, right? This is legal. They're both providing water, according to the Supreme Court. It's an example of that, right? Here's some more. You can see sort of these, differences in facilities, right? You can see dining rooms. You can see restrooms for whites only. Here's a Coca-Cola machine for white customers only, right? This is not equality the way it's supposed to be, right? And these systems, like I said, will last for almost 100 years in the South. I mean, that's crazy to think about the widespread implications of growing up in a time period where you're told you're no longer a slave, you're free, but look at all these restrictions that are being placed upon you, right? It's hard to even imagine what that would be like. And when people responded to it, when people disobeyed, these things, some places they're lynched, they're hanged from trees, right? Some people leave. There's an exodus. A lot of former slaves leave the South, and can you blame them, right? Get out of that place. It's difficult to do. Costs money, transportation, right? Finding a job. Some people don't have that option, but as many people as they can, they try to get out, right? They try to move to new areas of land. They try to organize, self-educate. In some ways, they're successful at that, but in some ways they aren't. And, it's unfortunate that's the way it plays out in the South, but that seems to be, the sort of deal that happened. Now, it's not all bad. There are some successes at the end of the day. Reconstruction was not a complete, total failure. We did briefly have African Americans who were elected to political office, and then they will be later again. We had the Civil Rights Amendments, 13, 14, and 15. New state constitutions are created. New federal laws are created to sort of help ease some of these racial issues. So while it's not all a failure, there are some things that are done that will lay foundations to help later, right? But there are a lot of failures to Reconstruction. You have these rights that were given quickly taken back away under segregation. You have white Southerners that, despite their hatred for these black Southerners, they really don't do much better. In fact, in some ways, there's a lot of very, very poor white Southerners too who suffer under Reconstruction, and that underlying racism will last through, the mid 1900s. I mean, that's crazy to think about how long some of this stuff is going to stay around. Sharecropping and issues of Jim Crow laws, and these organizations being formed. There's a lot of failures to Reconstruction. Like I said, you can make the argument there are some successes, but the fact that there is a civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s is evidence that this was not done correctly, right? And it's kind of odd because it's only really a United States thing. We'll talk about next year, when we have black people go and fight in World War I and World War II, and they go to Europe and they get treated equally, and then they come back to the United States where they're not allowed to sit at dining counters in the front of buses, and how hard that is for them. I mean, think about the sort of culture shock, I guess, that happens. Anyway, that's Reconstruction. Thus concludes your 7th grade year. No one would have thought it ended like this. Make sure you're working. If you've done that, keep up the good work. Proud of you. Like I said, the last assignment will be on Friday. It'll be due probably Tuesday, Wednesday. Once you get that done and everything's turned in, you're done. You're on summer vacation. Okay? You can go live it up. Except everything's closed, but you can go live it up. Have a great day.